Hello, my name is Horrifying, and today I have found three very disturbing stories from the backwoods creepy subreddit, and will be narrating them here. But before we begin, I did want to ask you that if you end up enjoying my narrations, then please do consider liking and subscribing, as that really does help the channel a lot. But either way, without any further ado, let's get into the narrations. The first story has been posted by user Emily32000. The Okefenokee Swamp is located mostly in southern Georgia and partly in North Florida. I'd been going there since I was a kid. My dad and uncle were avid outdoorsmen. They were always canoeing, hiking, hunting, fishing, etc. And I grew up learning to love the same things. Now, if the first thing that came to your mind when I said swamp was alligators, you would be correct. And the Okefenokee has some of the biggest around. It may sound super scary to non-southerners, but the old saying really is true. If you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. Canoeing slowly across the dark, tea-colored waters, if you pass too closely to one, it will quietly slink into the murky depths. He's not coming to get you. You simply interrupted his sunbathing. As elementary school kids in South Georgia, it was kind of a rite of passage to go on the Okefenokee field trip and be led on a guided tour by Okefenokee Joe. Joe was a true outdoorsman, extremely knowledgeable, friendly, good with the kids, and funny. Also, a little strange, but generally regarded as a good guy, a local legend, if you will. He would get that boat closer to the big gators than my dad ever let me get. He taught us kids all about them. We even got to hear the mating calls of some of the males and watch a lot of their behaviors up close. He would also show us all the birds, snakes, and other wildlife. The swamp's residents were so used to Joe's boat that they didn't flee when he got close. These were great memories. Anyhow, fast forward to my adulthood, and I still have a great love for the outdoors. I'd recently gotten married and was successfully getting my wife and stepdaughter into kayaking, camping, and hiking. I'd broken them in fairly easily. Calm lakes and beautiful, crystal clear blue spring-fed Florida waterways. We'd encounter some gators, but the girls had already become comfortable with the fact that they don't want to hurt humans. I decided that it was just about time to go out to Okefenokee and show them my childhood swamp stomping grounds. We headed out one weekend, kind of on a whim. I hadn't called ahead to reserve a campsite because I assumed it wouldn't be that busy just yet. Well, I was wrong. Every single tent and camping site was booked. I was pretty visibly bummed out, so I guess the ranger felt sorry for me. She told us to hold on. She was going to check just one more thing. When she came back, she had great news. There was a primitive group site available. If you aren't familiar, these are larger sites that are usually for big groups like Boy Scouts, usually situated away from the main campground areas. They do not have electricity. We camp 100% primitive all the time, so this wasn't an issue for us at all. The ranger explained that this particular group site had been closed for 2 seasons due to the road being washed out. She said they had just fixed the road the week before, but hadn't gotten around to relisting that site as available. She offered to sell it to us for a normal fee instead of the group fee. Well, deal. We pay, and she vaguely shows us on the map how to get to our home for the night. I remember thinking, damn, that's far as hell from all the other sites. Well, it's gonna be nice and quiet. Perfect. While at the office, we learned that that evening there was going to be a ranger-guided night paddle. This particular park inside the Okefenokee is a designated dark sky park, meaning there is very little light pollution. I was already excited about showing my family the stars and Milky Way, so getting out onto the water at night and seeing the skies that way sounded amazing. We decided to sign up for the night paddle and then headed off to find our campsite. When we got there, you could tell right away that the area hadn't been used for several years. Overgrown spider webs everywhere, teeming with the usual wildlife. I actually kind of prefer things to be this way, so I didn't think twice about it. It was so far from the campgrounds and the main office area that you couldn't hear a single sound of humans or vehicles. The area was large, so I walked around a bit to find a good spot to set up. I looked back at my map, trying to gauge exactly how this little island was shaped, and noticed that what I was seeing and what the map showed didn't quite line up. Whatever, I'm sure I'm just reading it wrong or something. We set up our camp, and we just enjoyed the sunshine and the sounds of nature. It was still very early spring, so the hordes of mosquitoes and various other swamp bugs weren't out in full force yet. The bugs in the swamp in the summer months could be a horror story on their own. Around 7:30 p.m., we loaded the kayaks back into my pickup and headed all the way across the park to the launch area, as our guided paddle was supposed to start at 8. We approached the launch area to unload, and there was a good 15 to 20 other people going on the paddle, led by a young, enthusiastic ranger. We all slipped off into the water with our headlamps on the red light setting. We exited the small canal we had been traveling in and emerged out into a large river type of waterway that meandered through the swamp. As we slowly and quietly creeped along, cypress trees draped with Spanish moss loomed over us on both sides, with a dramatic orange and pink sunset as their backdrop. The sun finally began disappearing, and the stars started to come out. It was absolutely stunning, and still one of my favorite kayaking memories. I'd never actually seen the Milky Way like that before. It was a new moon night, dark as could be. About a mile from our original launch, we all congregated out in the middle of the wide waterway and sat completely still and quiet. The motionless dark waters of the swamp reflected the skies like a mirror. Thousands of stars and galaxies twinkled above us and below us. It was like being in space. Shooting stars were visible every few minutes. It truly was magical. The only artificial light in the sky was the dull glow of Jacksonville, Florida on the horizon, which was about 100 miles to our southeast. After a while, the ranger snapped all of us out of our trances. It was time to head back. When we were paddling out there, it had been dusk or twilight for most of the trip. Not much light, but enough to kind of silhouette the trees and branches against the sky, and a slight glimmer on the water. By now, it was pitch black, and I do mean complete darkness. The ranger told us to switch our headlamps back on to their normal white light settings so that we could all see well enough to navigate out of the swamp. As each headlamp slowly switched on and the swamp was illuminated, we were met with hundreds of glowing eyes. Hundreds, I swear to you. Now, as I said earlier, I grew up out here. Gators were nothing new or scary to me at all. However, growing up, we never really stayed out on the water past dark. We would shine our lights out over the water to look at all the eyes, but from a dry land far away from the beasts. Now, I found myself and my little family quite literally pushing past floating gators with our kayaks. They were absolutely everywhere, all over the sides of the channel, as well as blocking our way in the center. The ranger was leading and assured everyone not to worry. He paddled up toward a huge group of shining eyes ahead of us and pushed right through them. Most of the eyes just disappeared under the water, but the gator directly in the ranger's path thrashed, and his tail actually hit the kayak. Holy hell! Sharp gasps from the group pierced the otherwise quiet southern air, but the ranger showed zero signs of panic, which was very reassuring. We all just trusted the young man that we weren't going to royally piss off these things by kayaking straight into them. As we went along, the sounds of gators being bumped by kayaks and thrashing were heard every couple of minutes. There weren't any other jarring sounds or movements, just the constant calling of frogs, cicadas, and the splashing of disturbed dinosaurs. When we finally turned back into the small channel that led to the launch, there were no more glowing eyes. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't been freaked out, but I can honestly say that I wasn't panicking. The ranger being so cool and confident while leading the way made it pretty easy to stay calm. Everyone started to relax again as we were nearing their launch, and we all got out, loaded up our boats, and one by one headed back to our camps. There was a line of red taillights trailing off toward the main campground, while my wife, daughter, and myself split off, alone, into the darkness towards the other side of the park where our site was. I do remember feeling kind of eerie at the time, but everyone had made it through the Gator Gauntlet safety with no problems. Now we were laughing about it and remarking on how cool the whole experience was. We were in high spirits, no stress. We had no idea of the terror that would come later in the night. We finally got back to our campsite around midnight, and we were starving. I got a nice fire going while my wife prepped dinner. The meal finished cooking around 1 a.m., and we finally all settled down to get comfy by the fire and eat. I hadn't taken even 2 bites of my food when the horrifying experience began. The cicadas and frogs were singing, but you tend to drown that out into background noise because it's so constant. But suddenly, out of the calming buzz of their singing, sprung a sound that I will never forget. A low, rumbling, guttural growl. Long, deep, vibrating in our chests. We all froze and looked at each other like, "Did you hear that?" Not even 10 seconds later, and we hear it again. Yes, we all definitely heard that. It sounded close, really close, like right on the other side of the brush that we were camped near. The only thing I could honestly relate it to at the time was the growling sound that T-Rex makes in Jurassic Park. I was terrified. I've been scared in the woods and the swamps. I've seen swamp gas, freaky figures, heard screams. I've been in the Marine Corps. I've encountered bears in the Appalachian Mountains. I've explored and experienced all kinds of places. When I tell you I have never been this scared, I mean it. Pure, raw, primordial fear. I immediately told the girls to get into the cab of my pickup. They get into the truck, and I hop into the bed of the truck with my little Magnum drawn. I figured being back there would get me up off the ground and give me a little advantage over whatever was coming. I told the girls to lock the doors and open the little sliding back window so we could communicate. I start frantically shining my flashlight round, aiming my gun along with it. I see absolutely nothing. We continue to hear the growling coming from one general direction, not getting any softer or louder, just continuously emitting in 3 to 5 second long intervals every 30 seconds or so. It was coming from the brush right next to our site. I shine my light all over that area, but I see nothing. Just thick leaves, underbrush, and pine. No movement whatsoever. Then, suddenly, we hear the sound coming from the complete opposite direction, more towards the open area of our site. I whip round and shine my light that way, and that's when I noticed the dense fog that had settled onto the entire area. It was a damp, sticky, suffocating fog. Almost right away, the growling sound was coming back from the original direction. I whip around, but immediately I hear it again, behind me, That's when I realized that there were two of them, whatever they are, doing a kind of call and answer with each other. That's also when I realized that the other sounds of the swamp had gone silent. Nothing but a call and answer of whatever was making these absolutely gut-wrenching sounds. It got deafeningly quiet for a moment. Nothing but a heavy fog which seemed to have a silent sound of its own. My wife, with shaky and trembling voice, told me that she wanted to leave immediately and that our daughter agreed. Now, I was absolutely terrified. Do not misunderstand this. However, the thought of just leaving all of my expensive camping gear behind was somehow more offensive. Not to mention, I was getting kind of frustrated. I am at home in this damn swamp. I know all the creatures here. I'm comfortable here. It's borderline pissing me off that something out here has me so scared and confused. I start trying to rationalize what could be making this sound. Suddenly, it started back up again. But now, it sounds like there could be 4 or 5 of them, all growling back and forth to each other, overlapping each other now, coming from all sides. A demonic chorus of deep, rattling, soul-sucking rumbles. Not getting any closer or farther away, just keeping us closely surrounded. I kept myself at least somewhat cool by affirming that it must be animals of some kind. I wouldn't even entertain the thought of anything supernatural or cryptic. It's not that I don't believe in that stuff. I do. I was just trying not to freak out. My wife kept saying it sounded like a big cat, and while I agreed, I knew that just wasn't it. It would have had to be massive lions or tigers to make that kind of extremely low, rumbling growl. It was impossible. I racked my brain for the biggest animal it could be, and I just kept landing on alligator. Yet, we had just paddled directly through an entire swarm of them. Some of them absolutely massive, and they had made a single sound the whole time we were out on the water. No, that could not be it. I even thought that the young, playful ranger had orchestrated some kind of extravagant practical joke on us poor campers out here all alone. Really and truly, I had no idea what it was, and not being able to see even a glimpse so I could shoot and protect my family was a very, very helpless feeling. I really wish I had more words for how it felt. Just blindly standing in the back of that truck, hearing what I could only imagine were the scariest, evilest, most vile things on the planet. Just knowing that they wanted to kill, eat, or otherwise mutilate myself and my family. It felt like an eternity, but we'd probably only been holed up in my truck for 10 or 15 minutes by now. It had finally gone quiet again, and I told the girls that we could leave, but I'm not leaving the gear. I climbed into the cab and started the truck and moved it, positioning it to where I could shine the headlights onto our stuff while I packed it all up. Gun in hand, I began rolling up the tent, gathering all of our crap and throwing it into the bed of the truck, praying nothing crazy happened, like my truck dying or some other perfectly timed cinematic horror moment. I tried to put on a confident air so as to not scare my family, but in my head, I felt so vulnerable, like I was something's prey. The growling still hadn't come back, but honestly, the silence was freaking me out more than anything. And the fog. I'll never forget how oppressive that fog felt. All of our gear was sopping wet with it, and I swear it was hard to breathe the air. The fire was nothing but a smolder, despite the fact that it had been roaring and bright 20 minutes ago. Just as I was rolling up the very last sleeping mat, one final, closer than before growl shook me to my core. I snatched that mat up and took off running, getting into the truck and taking off. None of us looked back. Later that night, when we had gotten back home, I did a bit of research, and apparently it was alligators. Large male alligators. That sound is their mating call. The louder, lower, and scarier sounding, the more the female gator finds it attractive. Those must have been the swamp's sexiest alligators, because I had never heard this sound in all my life. I had been under the impression that I knew what their mating call sounded like from my childhood experiences on Joe's boat and with my father and uncle. These alligators must have been absolutely massive to produce the sounds we were hearing, because it was nothing like what I'd ever heard in that swamp. It was exactly like that video. But I'm telling you, in person, you can physically feel it rattling your insides. Though I was somewhat comforted by the fact that the noises were just gators flirting and they weren't being aggressive towards us. My wife and daughter still think we were in danger because we were so close. I'm still not quite sure about that part. I got into Google Maps and tried to figure out exactly where we were camped, because from looking at the map the ranger had given us, we shouldn't have been that close to the water. I never could quite figure out where we'd ended up at. I didn't know if it was us being in the wrong place, or the fact that the area hadn't had any human activity for 2 years, or a combination of both that put us so close to all of this mating activity that would normally happen near areas with lots of humans. Either way, it made for a heart-pounding experience that we still talk to about this day. Also, as a small, funny addition to the story, looking back, the most hilarious thing was that my daughter was eating corn at the cob at the time we heard the first sound, and it was still in her hands. So, during this entire event of being terrified and hearing these growls, she has a corn cob in her hand. Now, while this wasn't the usual paranormal story, I did still find it quite interesting, and I wanted to know what these alligator sounds might have sounded like. So, In the comments section, I posted a link to a video of a quite large alligator growling, and I have to be honest, it's quite unnerving. The second story has been posted by user Aviator BYRD. I just want to say that I've learned to not outwardly identify as any sort of religion over time, but I will say that I have been able to pick up on energies from both people and places ever since I moved out on my own at 21. The first time I visited San Francisco, I really loved the vibe. It was a different but happy kind of place. I visited Washington a few weeks ago, and there was something about the Olympia region that gave me a full-on spiritual experience that changed my perspective. I almost felt high without being on drugs. After Washington, I drove through a little bit of Vancouver. Then I decided to take the 5 South to get back home to the Sacramento area of California. There was something about driving past the Oregon and the California border through Jefferson and Shasta County that was absolutely hellish. It's really hard to describe what I felt, but I keep telling people it felt like my mind was in a slaughterhouse. I can't describe why exactly. That whole area was picturesque and beautiful, but there was just a strange energy in the air. The sun had gone down by the time I got to a location about an hour north of Sacramento. I put my hand out the window in the complete darkness, and the air just felt different somehow. I'm dead tired, so I stop at a rest stop in Maxwell, California. Rest stops are typically lit at night, but there were absolutely no lights at all, making it extra eerie. I tried to fall asleep in my car, but I simply couldn't. I climb back into the driver's seat and make it home, where I fall asleep soundly. I attribute my state of mind to being hungry, tired, and having just slept in a car for almost a week straight. However, the next chance I get to check my email, I see an email from a pastor. There was only one other email I had from him from months prior, introducing me to the church. I have never really spoken to this pastor or even been to that church in a while, but there was a random email from him at about the same time I left Canada to head back down south. It was basically just a prayer, asking to protect me. I try to be logical, but there's some experiences where you feel like you can't deny that there was some kind of higher power or force at play. Anyway, maybe I'm just being loony, but there is something absolutely creepy about the Shasta Jefferson area. The third story has been posted by user Grouchy Relative 588. When I was around 15, me and my friends were driving around, going to all the haunted places around the basin. It was getting quite close to Halloween, so as is tradition, we were all trying to scare each other. First, we went to a place called the Haunted Woods. This is an actual business, not a place in the woods. Then, we went to an abandoned hotel near the Utah Reservation. Nothing of significance happened there. We didn't see or hear anything, and we were just goofing around and having fun. Then the driver says we were going to Skinwalker Ranch. At the time, I had never heard of Skinwalker Ranch, but I had heard plenty of stories about skinwalkers. I was intrigued at first, but as we dropped down the hill back behind the property, a feeling of total dread settled on me like a heavy blanket. Everyone in the car got more and more quiet, like they were feeling the heaviness as well. I don't think we should go here, I spoke softly. Oh, we're going, the driver announced. There's no moon tonight, and no flashlights allowed, he continued. I will just stay in the truck then. I have a really bad feeling, and I do not want to go. I spoke again. You are not staying in my truck alone. Now get out, he said rudely. I got out of the truck and looked over at my best friend. Her face was white and her eyes were wide and round, and I knew she felt the same way that I did. We shouldn't be here. The driver of the truck said that this was the back end of the huge ranch. I wouldn't have believed him that this was really Skinwalker Ranch if I didn't feel that it was in every nerve ending of my body. He walked over to an ancient post and pole fence, undid the loop of wire holding up a small gate, and laid it on the ground. There was an overgrown two-track road leading up into the darkness, and we followed as he led us up it. The horrible feeling of dread was almost overwhelming, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I wanted to go running back to the truck, but had a deep fear that something would pounce the moment I left the safety of the group. We weren't laughing and joking here. That heaviness was weighing on all of us, and we walked silently through the dark. As we walked, I tried to keep my eyes on my feet, but I would occasionally glance to either side of the two-track road. Each time I did, I would see a huge, black mass out in the tall grass. I told myself that it was just a cow, but each time I looked, it was in the same spot off to the left, following our journey to the old homestead. Finally, the driver and leader of our foolish expedition stopped and said that we were almost to the old homestead, that we needed to stay quiet in case the owners were around. As he turned to start walking again, a growl leapt from the darkness, and he stopped and took a step back. He wasn't our fearless leader anymore. His voice shook as he told us it was time to head back to the truck. We walked a little ways back, and then one of our group said they needed to use the bathroom. We stopped by a small stream running along the south end of the property. I was smoking and talking to one of my friends about how relieved I was that we were leaving. I glanced down at the stream at the same time my friend did, just in time to see a black figure emerging from the water. It was not a cow. It was not a coyote. It looked like a too skinny and too tall man. We both screamed and ran back to the road. That was the last straw for everyone, and we all ran the entire way back to the truck. Now, I know that is eerie, but kind of uneventful. Have no fear. My story, unfortunately, isn't over yet. A few months later, this adventure had slowly left my mind. I had started to convince myself that the figures in the darkness were just cows, and that it was probably just the dark running water playing tricks on my eyes, making me see things emerging from the water that weren't really there. My best friend had come over to my house to sit outside, joke around, and smoke cigarettes. We did this quite frequently. Like I said in my last story, we lived in the middle of nowhere, so dumb things like this were about as much fun as we could have. So, we are sitting in her car just across the road from my house. Her car is pointed towards the town park, which was just about a block away from my house. There are no other houses on the way up the park, so with the street lamps on at the park, you can basically see everything up there. "Oh, look, it's a deer," my friend said suddenly. I could see a set of glowing eyes on the very far end of the park. "Oh, yeah, there it is," I reply. We watch it as it slowly walks towards the center of the park. In this spot is a huge metal slide, or I guess jungle gym type of thing, that is probably 10 to 12 feet tall. As the deer is walking, I notice that for some reason I cannot make out any features of the deer. It seems to always be just out of reach of the street lamps that are dotted throughout the park. The deer is right next to the slide when it suddenly stands up. The eyes that we were watching are suddenly even with the platform of the slide, which would make this deer 10 to 12 feet tall. Then it starts to walk, standing on its hind legs. Me and my friend both start panicking. What the hell is that? That is not a deer. We keep watching this extremely tall creature cross the park when my friend decided we are driving up there. She locks the doors and we head towards the park. When we were almost there, the eyes had crossed the street and went into the neighborhood across from the park. By the time we got there, whatever it was had vanished. Another few months go by. The event definitely rattled us, and there was no convincing ourselves that it was a deer. Deer do not walk on their hind legs, and they are not 10 feet tall. One night, I am at the same friend's house. This friend lived smack dab in the middle of a huge farmland. All around her were pastures. It was very peaceful most of the time. We had spent the night watching movies and hanging out. I went and started my car, and we were smoking together on her porch before I left. We were just chatting when suddenly her eyes leave my face and look behind me, and her eyes grow wide. I turn to look and see two glowing red eyes just past the fence into her neighbor's pasture. "What is that?" I managed to squeak out. "I don't know," she whispers back. The eyes remained fixed on us for about 30 seconds, then turned to the left, blinked, and vanished. We both ran back in the house. I didn't dare go home for another 45 minutes. If my car hadn't already started, I probably wouldn't have left at all. A couple of years after these events, I was speaking with a Ute tribal member that I worked with, and she said something that gives me goosebumps to this day. She told me, "It isn't what's on the ranch that you should be afraid of. It's what follows you when you leave." I am convinced that something followed us from that ranch, and those terrifying events was something warning us to never go back. I never did, and I never will. The deep woods are a interesting place. In heavily forested areas, even walking for just a few dozen minutes into one direction may lead you to a location that has never been touched by human hands. In such places, is it really so strange to think that unnatural things can happen? Perhaps so. But either way, I do hope that you enjoyed these narrations, and even if you didn't, I do want to wish you a good rest of your day.